Hi, I'm very happy to be here with Garrett Jones from the Virginia Department of Social Services. Garrett, your title is Permanency Program Manager. Is that the titles have changed? So what is your exact title there?
My title is Family Engagement and Resource Family Program Manager.
Great, great. So we have Garrett here, and he's going to talk to us a little bit about the Kin First culture that the Department of Social Services is working so hard to create across the Commonwealth of Virginia. And from that comes a lot of questions that all of you have about kinship care and its relationship to foster care. So we've got some questions to give to Garrett, but we want to start with letting Garrett have a chance to introduce himself and kind of what is the role of the department with the local departments. Garrett?
Thanks, Kate. And it's great to be with you today. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.
Here in Virginia, we are a state supervised, locally administered child welfare system. So what that means is, as the Virginia Department of Social Services, we establish policy, enforce regulations, and provide guidance to local departments related to how to operate. Now, decisions related to placement and assessment of relative caregivers or prospective foster families or adoptive families are left to the local department. We do offer instruction to the local departments as to how that should occur, and we offer support to ensure that best practice is followed. However, the local department ultimately possesses the ability to make decisions about, children entering care, where they're placed, and what permanency looks like for every child who enters foster care in Virginia. And here in Virginia, we're in the midst of an evolution in the direction of a kin first culture across the child welfare continuum. And what that looks like is a deliberate effort to prioritize family involvement through family engagement, and really approaching our work as child welfare professionals from the perspective of a learner, and understanding that our children and their families are the experts on themselves, and they understand their family system much more comprehensively than we ever could. Our evolution to a kin first culture also means that we acknowledge that families are large groups of people, and while there may be a parent or parents and a child who are in the midst of a crisis, outside of their immediate supports or the relatives that they're immediately involved in, there are relatives that extend beyond that. And it's our job as child welfare professionals to make sure that we offer family members and individuals who are important to those children and families the opportunity to be involved and engaged in decision making, again, because they are the experts, and they are the most well-informed and understand how best to develop plans to ensure that children can return home whenever possible and maintain the connections to those adults in their lives who are important, so that we don't see children who are separated from their families and languish in foster care. We also know that whenever children who enter foster care are placed with relatives, they are 98% less likely to age out of foster care. On average, they spend less than or 4 months less in foster care than children who are not placed with relatives. And they experience, on average, 3 fewer placement disruptions while they're in foster care. So we know good things happen when we preserve those family connections.
Yeah. Thank you, Garrett. One of the things that families have asked about is when we have kinship foster care, how is that different than non-related foster care? And how is the department supporting that?
Sure. So when a child enters foster care, he or she can be placed with a relative immediately upon entering care. And most often in those cases, relatives learn that they have family members who are in crisis and a child that needs their support. They're not approved foster parents at that time. So the local department can immediately run state police name searches to rule out any barrier crimes that would prevent the kinship family, the relative, or the fictive kin provider from being approved. And I use the term fictive kin it's kind of an all-encompassing term that describes anyone in the life of the child, or the family or the parents who are connected with them and understand intimately how to support them, and who present the best opportunity for reunification and support of the child when entering foster care. So when a relative or a fictive kin provider is identified, the local department can complete state police name checks on all adult household members to rule out the presence of barrier crimes. And barrier crimes are non-negotiable and mean, ultimately, if that home cannot be approved, and that applies to non-relative foster parents as well. And then they're able to run searches of the Child Protective Services Central Registry through our databases to ensure that there's no history of a founded child abuse or neglect complaint on that prospective, relative or kinship provider. And then the child may be placed immediately. And from there, the local department may be granted a waiver by the commissioner. And of course, I act as a representative of the commissioner, as do my regional staff. We can grant a waiver that allows for 6 months for that relative caregiver or fictive kin provider to complete pre-service training, a mutual family assessment, to complete physical examinations and tuberculosis testing, all that are required for approval. So the local departments have that period of 6 months to complete that, and my regional staff support their efforts in doing that.
And during that time, Garrett, would they receive any funding to help support that child?
They would. They are considered approved by Virginia standards immediately, and they would be entitled to a monthly maintenance payment. The amount of that's based on the age of the child. And then beyond that, they would be entitled to an enhanced maintenance payment. And Virginia uses a tool known as the VMAT. That's the Virginia Enhanced Maintenance Assessment Tool that really focuses on assessing the needs of a child in foster care, and the score that results from administration of that tool indicates an enhanced maintenance payment amount that is paired then with the maintenance payment amount as a financial support to all foster parents in Virginia, including kinship foster parents.
And if the CPS staff decide that they would like to go ahead and place that child with that relative, and you have the 6-month window for getting them approved as foster parents, that I understand that process. But what about for those families who agree to take the child but don't want to become foster parents to the child, but they will keep the child? What's that look like?
So those families are eligible for a child-only additional TANF payment of up to $200. And in those cases, it is important to note that the requirement is that the provider be a blood relative. So fictive kin does not apply in this situation. But in those cases, they would not be an approved foster parent. However, the child would reside with them, and they would be eligible for that additional $200 child only addition to TANF.
Right. So they would get TANF and the $200.
That's correct.
But they have to be able to demonstrate that they're a blood relative.
Yes.
And that is federal law. That is not a Virginia requirement. I believe that is still federal, right?
That's correct.
All right. So the next question that people have asked is, if they are approved now, let's say they're approved now to be a kinship foster parent, and they go through this process, 6 months, they're getting their payments, and then they officially become a foster parent. Are there requirements for those families who now have become the foster parent to work toward a more permanent solution for that child? Are there rules about permanent placement or adoption that relates to kinship foster parents that they need to know?
Sure. Well, as with any child who enters foster care, regardless of whether they're placed with a kinship foster parent or a non-relative foster parent, the primary focus of the local department is reunification with the child's parent or parents. So from the moment that the child is placed with a kinship caregiver, those efforts in moving in the direction of reunification are underway. And the local department is working hard with the child's parents to address the issues that led to the removal of the child and placement into foster care. So the kinship caregiver would be a critical part of that team from day one. After the 6-month period of time, really when that waiver expires, the waiver is intended just to allow local departments an expansion of time to meet that approval criteria, to make it more possible to place children with relatives when they are identified. So, at that 6-month period, there's really not a significant change in the role of the kinship caregiver. They're still operating as a member of a professional team, and they're engaged in all decision-making related to permanency of the child. And then, in Virginia, ultimately, if the child is not able to be reunited with their parents, the local department would look first to relatives to explore adoption or permanency for the child.
Okay, and the relatives would be the first ones that you would look at for that purpose, especially if the relative is the foster parent.
Absolutely, yes.
Right. And so with the advent of the Family First legislation and the ability of the state to be able to reprogram some of its existing federal dollars for prevention and services, is it possible those kinship foster parents who are working with the birth family for reunification, that there are some other supports and services that the department's able to fund to help bring about reunification?
Absolutely. Not necessarily connected to the Family First legislation, but certainly the local department, while they're providing support and services to the parent, they're also focusing on the needs of that kinship caregiver and making sure that, they have all of the supports that they need to safely care for the child and support reunification. And again, in Virginia, family partnership meetings are really the mechanism that local departments are encouraged to use and frankly are mandated to use when making decisions related to placement and permanency for children in foster care. So those family partnership meetings should occur routinely while the child is in foster care, and really should be a time for the kinship foster parents, other family members, and professionals to come together to talk about, what the needs of the child are, what the needs of the kinship caregiver are, the ongoing needs of the parent, and to start to make decisions about, really what the child's future is going to look like beyond remaining in foster care.
Great. So it sounds like family is really at the heart of all the matters.
Absolutely.
That's right. So some of the other questions that we have, we've already talked about having to be approved through foster care. That's only if you just intend to be a foster parent to the child. Otherwise, it's the TANF process, and that's a different part of the agency that's under benefit programs. And somebody has asked if there will be an open CPS case in the kinship household. So we want to kind of break that question up a little bit to make the answers a little clearer. So when a family just on their own takes a child from another family member and there's no foster care involvement, there's no CPS involvement, there's no TANF, it's just an informal moving of a child from one home to another home, that doesn't engage any of the state systems. So there wouldn't be an open CPS case because of that. Then there's the circumstances that you talked about earlier when somebody is coming in through CPS and CPS has opened a case for that child and that child gets placed in a kinship home. Does that CPS case remain open while that child's moved into that home if they're not going to become a foster parent, but they're providing emergency placement?
Right. So yes, if a child does not enter foster care, and the local department identifies relatives that they then engage in a discussion about caring for the child for an extended period of time, the local department would continue to provide services to the child's parents to address, really the issues and the needs of the parents that led to the child and the family coming into contact with the child welfare system.
Right.
So there certainly would be an ongoing effort on the part of the local department to provide the services to the parent that they need. In terms of, oftentimes the question of CPS sort of is around sort of the ongoing investigation. But if the investigation, ends with, a determination of unfounded or founded, the local department can continue to serve the parent in either of those scenarios to, really with the intent of developing the capacity of the parent and supporting their development of capacity to care for their child to again, make reunification possible.
Okay. And then if the child is in foster care and the relative has taken the child and become a kinship foster parent to the child, why don't you talk to them a little bit about what happens with the open CPS case at that point?
Sure. So if the child enters foster care, the finding of the Child Protective Services case would be founded, which means that, it was determined that the child was, abused or neglected, and that level of abuse and neglect warranted removal from the custody of those parents to ensure the child's safety. So at that point, the child would enter foster care. That becomes a foster care case. And the parents would be provided with a service plan from the local department that outlines the steps that they need to take in order to be reunified with their parents. And while it outlines the steps, there's also active involvement from the local Department of Social Services during that time in making sure that the family is connected to the supports and the resources that they need in order to engage in that plan and ultimately be reunified with their child. And meanwhile, the child is residing with the kinship caregiver or, in some cases, a non-relative foster parent. And in both of those cases, whether it be kinship or non-relative foster parents, those foster parents, again, are a vital component of that treatment team. And one of the competencies of, that are assessed in approving foster parents in Virginia is the ability to work as a member of a professional team and to support that reunification. So again, between family partnership meetings and regular treatment team meetings, the group that's working with the family, professionals and relatives, non-professionals who are involved, convene to really talk about how things are going, what additional supports are needed, and everyone's actively involved and informed as the case proceeds.
Okay, good. And what we can do for all of you right now is to just make sure you understand there are basically 3 different types of kinship care. There's a situation in which you have kinship care where the family is just making some decisions to move kids around outside of the jurisdiction of a court or state agency or anything like that. And that's kind of what's called the informal kinship care. Then there's the kind of kinship care that is kinship custody kinship care, in which the kin has the legal custody of the child. So you're able to have court orders to make sure that you're able to keep the child safe. There's a guardian ad litem appointed for the child. It goes through a court process. And either one of those 2 types of kinship, you can go and try to get benefits from your local benefits office at your local Department of Social Services or through the Common Help Virginia website. Then the type of we're also talking about today is the kinship foster care, which has more supports and services available because the children have been subjected to abuse or neglectful situations, and the county has made a determination they have to take custody to protect that child. So we're talking about 3 different types here. I just want to make sure that everybody is clear on what we're talking about. So one of the questions that came up was about whether or not children will have medical benefits. And we know that if the family is keeping the other family intact and there's no involvement of the courts or the state, then the child's insurance, whoever they have insurance with their birth parents, would still be in play. If you go through a custodial piece in which you're a kinship custody, then you can go through the process of the Common Help website to be able to get Medicaid benefits for the child that you now have legal custody of. Then there's the point of kinship foster care, and where you come in, Garrett, to talk to us about, are there medical benefits for the kids when they come through the foster care system?
Yes, every child who enters foster care in Virginia is eligible for Medicaid. So every child who's in foster care will have Medicaid coverage.
Great, great. And the other question that was asked is, how is kinship different than traditional foster care? Do you want to, and I'm thinking we're talking about kinship foster care versus non-relative foster care. So you want to try that one?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, so kinship foster care, again, is based on a relationship that's established with the child and family prior to the child entering care. And so in Virginia, we use the term kinship foster parent. That can be a relative, a blood relation, or it could be someone that falls under the category of fictive kin. And fictive kin could be, a step parent, a step grandparent. It could be a neighbor, a close family friend, a godparent. In some cases, we've seen children who were very connected to staff at their school, who had been supportive of the child and their family prior to the child entering care. And in those cases, again, the family is really informing the local department as to who in their network of support they would like to be engaged in planning. And beyond that, the local department is, exploring relative connections beyond those that immediately come to mind, for the child and family in the midst of crisis. So that term fictive kin really is expansive. Yeah. Traditional foster care would be non-relative families or parents who, really hear the message of need, evaluate, is this something I can do, and then make the commitment to engage in the process of approval, which includes pre-service training, a mutual family assessment, of course, background checks, physical examinations, all of those things required to approval. And those things occur before approval of the family is issued and before they're eligible to serve children in foster care as foster parents.
Right. All right. So another question that's been asked is, who funds kinship care? So let's break it down. If you're not going into the court system, you're not going to the state system, you're funding kinship care as the kinship care provider, or whatever you can arrange with the family. If you are going through the court-ordered kinship care, you may be getting federal, state dollars that through the benefits program. And then we have kinship foster care. Go, Garrett.
Yeah, so, again, kinship foster care, relatives or fictive kin who are approved as kinship foster parents receive a monthly maintenance payment that may include the enhanced maintenance that they're eligible for. And that really is a combination of state and federal dollars. It kind of depends on sort of qualifying factors related to the child when they enter care. Whether it's, completely federal dollars or whether, it is, Virginia Children's Services Act funding is the actual funding stream that's used to support those placement costs.
Which can be state and local then.
Absolutely.
Like if the child is not eligible for the 4E financial benefits. All right, so there was a complicated question asked that Garrett and I have been trying to figure out exactly how to break this question down. So we're going to give it our best shot. And that was, why do DSS workers interpret that you have to be a grandparent and supply proof in order to access kinship or TANF child-only benefits. And Garrett and I talked about this. And if you are talking about getting the federal benefit of TANF child-only payments, then there is a federal requirement that you have to be a blood relative. So that's why if you are trying to get benefits as a custodial kinship custody parent, or as a just an informal placement, you're being asked to provide proof, because that's required in order for those benefits to come forward. Then you break it down, as Garrett and I talked about the kinship foster parent, and he has some answers for you on that in that regard.
Sure. Again, so, when a child enters foster care, the local department's efforts to engage family and discover who is important to the child in that family in order to increase the likelihood that the child is able to be reunified with their parent, but also mitigating the impact of the trauma that results from the child being separated from their parent by, utilizing a kinship foster parent. And in those cases, again, the family really is the expert, and that's the approach of the child welfare work here in Virginia and Virginia's Kin First culture. So it may be that upon discovering family members and fictive kin, or natural supports that exist in the life of the child and family, that group, along with the local department, comes to the decision that it would be a non-relative, non-blood relative kinship caregiver who would be best suited to be the placement for the child, while perhaps the relatives are involved in spending time with the child regularly, supporting the parents, engaging in the foster care service plan to make reunification possible, and are involved in supporting that primary caregiver. So when a child comes into foster care, it really is possible for a relative or a non-relative individual to be approved immediately to provide placement of that child, again, to increase the likelihood of reunification and to mitigate that impact of trauma. So it's a little different there. There's no requirement that proof be provided to establish blood relation.
Right. And that's within the kinship foster care area.
Yes.
So that's that. How do we go about kinship adoption? If you're a kinship foster parent, I'm going to assume these are people who are looking at kinship foster care and want to move toward adoption. So let's start with that. Okay, Garrett?
Sure. Again, starting from point of entry into foster care, the local department is starting first and foremost with reunification, and that's the focus of their efforts.
Mm-hmm.
If they're unsuccessful in in making or getting to the point to where the family can safely be reunified, they would look to relatives to plan for permanency for the child, and adoption is obviously a part of that. Mm-hmm. So the process of adopting really is not different for a kinship care provider in terms really of the process. In many cases, children who enter foster care are already placed with their kinship caregiver. Mm-hmm. So when the goal changes legally to adoption, there's typically a requirement that the child be in the home for a period of 6 months prior to being able to sign an adoptive home agreement and kind of move in that arena of finalizing the adoption. But in cases where the child's already with the relative, that 6 months has been achieved. Mm-hmm. Now there could be situations where a local department has placed a child in a non-relative foster home. They've worked toward reunification. They've determined it's not possible, and they've reinvested in family engagement and discovery. And through that, they've been able to identify a relative or fictive kin provider who really is best suited to serve the long-term needs of the child, because we want to preserve those family connections whenever possible. And in those cases, the decision could be made by the local department that they would then transition the child from the non-relative foster home to the relative, with the intent of finalizing that adoption. And in those cases, the child would need to be placed in the home with that relative or fictive kin provider for a period of 6 months prior to signing the adoptive home agreement and moving into that arena of finalization.
Right. And then there's also the situation where if the kinship foster parent says, I'm not comfortable with adopting because they're my grandchild and I don't want to be their mom and their grandma, I'd rather have custody. There's also the KinGap program that you can also move toward a different kind of arrangement other than adoption. Can you talk a little bit about that for them?
Sure. So KinGap really is intended to provide another avenue, if you will, of exit from foster care when we have situations where relatives say, I really do not want to see my child or my relative's rights to their child terminated. And in that case, the child would be, or the relative would be eligible based on the child's age for a maintenance stipend that they would receive to care for the child for an extended period of time, but it would not be a finalized adoption. So they would all of the legal aspects that come with adoption and being the sole custodian of a child are not accomplished through KinGap, and the child's parents still have the opportunity in those cases to be reunited with their child down the road. Now, in those cases, oftentimes the local department does not continue to provide services to those parents beyond that decision. But it's certainly a possibility that the child could be reunited in the future. And KinGap really is reserved for older youth, so children who are 13 or older. And quite frankly, in Virginia, we've not had a lot of cases that have sort of fallen under that KinGap umbrella. I will add that if we have a situation where you have let's say a 15-year-old who's in care who also has siblings who are in care that are under the age of 13, those younger siblings would be qualified as eligible for KinGap because of that relation to the older sibling, the 15-year-old.
And in those cases, the relative who's the kinship foster parent actually gets legal custody of the children with less visits from the local department, and the case is sort of quasi closed.
Right.
But there are still avenues for reopening. The other thing for people to know is that when it comes to kinship adoption, if you're going the informal route, where you have the children who have been placed with you, you'll have to go through a court process and have lawyers and all those people involved when you do kinship adoption. And you'll have to be funding all of that because they're not involved in the foster care system. So just be aware that if CPS places a child with you and they close out the case and the child remains with you, if you want to go through adoption, you're going to be responsible for going through the TPR and getting everything done yourself when you're not engaged in the foster care system.
Correct.
Right, Garrett?
Correct.
Okay. So when one of the questions was, will they keep their benefits if the children are adopted through kinship foster care? And I think you can answer that.
Yeah. Adoption, included in the adoption process, is some negotiation. So there are adoption negotiators that the Virginia Department of Social Services sort of oversees. And as part of that negotiation, they're assessing the needs of the child, the current needs and anticipated long-term needs. And through that negotiation, the determinations are made related to financial support, access to services, and ongoing benefits. So those cases really are, determined independently of one another. There's really not a standard process or really a sort of canned answer I can give to that. It really is something that's determined through that process of negotiation.
Case by case basis.
Yes.
If it's determined that the child needs supports and services after kinship foster care through adoption, if the process determines that's necessary, then the child would retain benefits.
Sure.
There's also, and some of you will know this from other webinars we've had, is the idea of once a child's been adopted after the age of 15, I believe is the age now, they qualify for certain educational benefits post high school diploma. So you'll want to make sure you keep track of that if you're adopting a child over the age of 15 or 16. So we've moving toward this kin first culture, Garrett, is very exciting. And there are lots of moving parts, I am sure, that you guys are all trying to manage as we change cultures here in Virginia. Have any of the family first pieces of the legislation from the federal government impacted any of your practices in terms of prevention and providing services to birth parents and kinship parents?
Sure. Yeah, in terms of prevention, we've moved in the direction now of sort of rebranding prevention, if you will, as in-home services. And the intent there is to, again, create the opportunity for family members to make decisions about what is in the best interest of their relatives and their children. And so local departments are empowered now and have been instructed through guidance and technical support from the Virginia Department of Social Services and regional staff to really work with relative caregivers to determine what is in the best interest of the child when a family, is determined to be in crisis, and a plan needs to be developed. And a plan may be developed outside of foster care. No longer is the child going to enter foster care or not. It could be that, the child stays very short term with a relative until the crisis of their acute need is mitigated so the child can safely return home. It could be that the child stays a little longer, up to 6 months with a relative. And then in the third scenario, there is the option of the child remaining with the relative for an extended period of time. In those cases, most often the relative would be encouraged to petition for custody of the child, but all of that's occurring outside of the child actually entering foster care. So the intent there is to mitigate the need for the child to enter foster care. However, it really is critical that the local department really carefully assess the needs of the relative caregivers in those three scenarios to make sure that the child and the caregiver are going to have all of the supports that they need so that plan is sustainable, particularly in that second scenario and the third scenario that I outlined, where there's an extended period of time where a relative, although they don't have custody of the child, is providing care for the child and meeting their, physical, emotional, and behavioral needs. So things like enrolling them in school, making sure that they have access to the supports that they were, perhaps relying on or involved in prior to that plan being developed with the relative is very important. So in those cases, I encourage any relative that finds themselves faced with that situation to really think about what their needs are going to be and to be actively involved in engaging the local department in those discussions, because again, you are the experts. The local department is responding to the crisis and working to develop a plan, but certainly needs the input of the kinship caregiver in that scenario. And then when it comes to children entering foster care, we for a long time Virginia had been far too reliant on what we refer to as congregate care or institutional care of children.
Right.
And what Family First really requires and has allowed us to implement is that when children enter foster care and they are placed in congregate care, the focus really be addressing an acute need and treatment. And congregate care has never been intended to be a placement. It is not a place where a child should live for an extended period of time. It is in no way, shape, or form equivalent to a family and all of the love and support that a family can provide. So, as a response to Family First legislation and us trying to really address our reliance on congregate care, we now have our regional staff routinely reviewing cases of children in congregate care to identify those cases where children are ready to transition. And working them with the local department to help them understand how to develop plans to make that happen. And then moving forward, really the charge for the local department is anytime a decision is made to place a child in a congregate care facility, that they begin planning for discharge immediately. And that is always going to include engaging the family and helping to develop that plan.
Right, right. The Family First had some impact.
Yes.
Yes. So one of the things that people say is so if we're going to focus so much on making sure that children are going with their kinship caregivers, that kinship is the first placement and the most desirable placement, will there still be a need for non-related foster parents?
Oh, absolutely. Oftentimes, local departments encounter families in crisis, without previous knowledge of the family. And, responding to a situation that is urgent enough to require that a child be separated from their parents, is going to involve identifying a placement for that child very quickly. And while we're working with local departments to develop the capacity, the skills to engage families, engage parents, engage children in a discussion of who's important to them, placement is not always going to be immediately possible. Non-relative foster parents are absolutely needed in those in those cases, in those situations. And then, Virginia, our view of foster parents are, we need them to serve as a support initially to a child and their family and support that reunification, not as a substitute for the child's family. However, it happens quite frequently, and it will continue to happen, that when a child's placed in a non-relative foster home, they thrive. And the family members that are engaged are supportive of that non-relative foster home becoming the permanent plan and the forever family for that child. So there's an incredible need for non-relative foster parents. And again, I think, Virginia needs to improve our ability to be transparent in our communication with non-relative foster parents. And then when non-relative foster parents are exploring, the becoming approved as foster parents, for us to really reinforce, the role of supporting reunification, first and foremost, and that being the focus of the foster family's work, so that we're not misleading families, by operating under the assumption that, they're going to have the opportunity to adopt any child who's placed in their home, because that's just not the case.
Right. Well, thank you for that. So as you guys can see, there's still going to be a need for all of you foster parents out there, and we still need to find more foster parents. And one of the great things about a Kin First culture is, as a foster parent, if you've been taking care of that child for a while, you're going to be a great resource for that child long term also. So there's also going to be a lot of work to try to help you stay engaged with that child, because children do better when they have a lot of different adults who are compassionate and care about them, who get engaged in their lives, whether it's mentors or big brothers, big sisters, or any other way that you can help support that birth family. Then a lot of you have also, over the course of time, been talking a lot, and this is not something I'm going to aim at Garrett. I want to tell you guys this is going to come later. There's been a lot of questions about ICPC. And when you are a relative and you've taken a child from another state who has been in foster care, and all the ins and outs of that. And we will try to arrange an ICPC interview like this to help clear up some of that. That's a whole different portion of VDSS. I don't know, is Denise still there, or is she retired long ago, I would guess, right?
She retired. The program manager is now Tamika Rose.
Oh, okay, great. Well, we'll be getting in touch with Tamika. Also, Garrett, there are kinship navigators across the state to help those kinship families. Can you tell us a little bit about Kinship Navigator before we close out?
Sure. There are 5 Kinship Navigator programs that operate across the state, and those programs are funded through a federal grant that Virginia is able to access. And really, the Kinship Navigators are intended to serve as a resource for both kinship caregivers who exist outside of the child welfare system, and even those that exist inside of the child welfare system. To really be a point of contact to connect them with resources that they may need to ensure that they're able to meet the needs of children. So educational resources, treatment resources, financial supports, those kinds of things. And I will say that beyond just the Kin Navigator programs, VDSS is working on developing a kinship website that is standalone and exists outside of sort of the child welfare system, if you will, because it's important for kinship caregivers who are so invested in caring for and supporting children to not be faced with a concern that if they're reaching out for help, that there could be some child welfare response there. So we feel like it's important for that website to exist outside of, and those resources outside of the local Department of Social Services. So, a kinship caregiver can reach out and really get an understanding of the supports and services available in their community.
That's great. We'll look forward to seeing that website. Garrett, thank you very much for taking such a good chunk of your day out to do this with us. We really appreciate it. The families appreciate it. And one of the things I'll tell all of you is that Garrett is as close as email to me, and he's been great about responding to your questions. And when I have to reach out for you to him, he's always very responsive and gets back to us right away. So as you have other questions or concerns, you can let me know. Garrett has been a wealth of information, continues to be pushing in the right directions for Virginia. We're really glad that you're there, Garrett. So thank you for all of your support.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
All right, thanks. Have a great day, everybody. Bye.
Bye.